The year 1807. Think about that date for a moment. Thomas Jefferson is president. Napoleon is carving up Europe. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of what we now call the American West, a man named John Colter is about to become the first of a breed that would define American adventure for the next 40 years. Now here's the thing that gets me about Colter's story. He's with Lewis and Clark, you know, the Lewis and Clark expedition, NTF, and they're heading back to civilization after 2 years in the wilderness. 2 years. And what does Colter do? He asks to leave the expedition. He wants to go back into that wilderness, alone. Picture this. You've just spent 24 months in territory where grizzly bears weigh 800 pounds and winter temperatures drop to 40 degrees below zero. You've eaten things that would make a modern survival show contestant quit. You've slept on frozen ground for weeks at a time, and when someone offers you a ticket back to hot meals and warm beds, you say no thanks. But Colter doesn't just go back into the wilderness. He discovers something that will haunt American imagination for decades. Steam rising from the earth, water boiling without fire, geysers shooting hundreds of feet into the air on schedule, like some kind of natural clock. When Colter returns to civilization and describes what he's seen, people have a name for it. Colter's Hell. And here's what's fascinating. They don't believe him. Not for a second. It sounds too impossible, too fantastic. It'll be 60 years before government surveyors confirm that every single detail of Colter's descriptions was absolutely accurate. Every single detail. But Colter isn't working alone out there. Manuel Liesser, H.A.P. And this is a name you need to remember. Manuel Liesser is running the Missouri Fur Company, and he's got a vision. Liesser sees something that most people miss. There are fortunes to be made in those mountains. Not gold fortunes, not silver. Fortunes, but beaver fortunes. Now, beaver pelts might not sound like much to us, but in 1807, a good beaver pelt could buy you what $1,000 buys today. Why? European fashion. Beaver felt hats were the symbol of wealth and status across Europe and the eastern United States. The demand was enormous, and the American Rocky Mountains were thick with beavers that had never seen a trap. So Liesser starts sending men into territories that would make modern special forces operators nervous. These aren't weekend camping trips we're talking about. These men are heading into regions where the closest human settlement might be 500 miles away, where winter storms can kill you in hours if you don't know what you're doing, where grizzly bears see humans as food, and this is where our legendary figures start emerging from history. Hugh Glass. Now there's a name that should give you chills, and you'll understand why before we're done with this story. Glass abandons his life as a sailor. Think about that. A man who's seen the world's oceans decides the Rocky Mountains are where he wants to test himself. He follows the Missouri River upstream into territory that exists on no map, carrying nothing but a rifle, a knife, and the kind of courage that borders on insanity. Then there's Jedediah Smith. Smith leaves his Methodist upbringing in New York for mountain peaks, where, as he'll write in his journal, God speaks through thunderstorms and silent snowfall. Smith becomes a different kind of mountain man, educated, religious, keeping detailed records of everything he sees. But don't let that fool you into thinking he's soft. Smith will survive things that would kill most people twice over. And Jim Bridger. Here's someone special. Bridger signs with William Ashley's company when he's barely 18 years old. 18! Most kids that age today are worried about college applications. Bridger is stepping into a world where survival depends on reading wind patterns like a language, understanding animal behavior like a science, and enduring hardships that would make a medieval peasant grateful for his life. Now here's what you have to understand about these men. They're not just tough guys with rifles. They're becoming something new, something that's never existed before in human history. They're learning to think like predators, move like shadows, and adapt to environments that should kill them. How do they do it? They learn from people who've been mastering these skills for thousands of years, native tribes. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because we're not talking about the Hollywood version of frontier relations. We're talking about men who recognize that their survival depends on learning from cultures that understand the land in ways Europeans never imagined. These mountain men adopt native techniques for tracking game across granite slopes, where a footprint on rock tells a story that could save your life. They learn to read weather in cloud formations, to find water in seemingly barren landscapes, to understand which plants heal and which plants kill. Think about what's happening here. European Americans are entering a landscape that operates by completely different rules than anything they've ever known. The skills that made you successful in Missouri or Pennsylvania or New York, forget them. Out here, you learn the land's language or the land kills you. And in 1825, I know. Remember this date. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company forms. This is the beginning of what historians call the golden age of American mountain exploration. But I think of it as something bigger. This is the birth of a uniquely American character type, the mountain man. These aren't just trappers we're talking about. They're becoming explorers, diplomats, survival experts, storytellers, and cultural bridges between worlds that have never met before. They're mapping territories that won't appear on government surveys for decades. They're establishing trade relationships with native tribes that will influence American policy for generations. But here's what makes their story so compelling, and this is something I want you to really think about. These men are choosing this life. They're not forced into the wilderness by poverty or circumstance. They're drawn to it by something deeper, something that calls to a part of the human spirit that most of us have buried under civilization's comfort. What kind of man abandons a warm house and regular meals for the chance to test himself against grizzly bears and Rocky Mountain winters? What drives someone to seek freedom so complete that it comes with the constant possibility of death? The answer to those questions defines not just the mountain man era, but something essential about the American character. These men are chasing something that goes beyond money, beyond comfort, beyond safety. They're chasing the most dangerous and valuable thing humans can pursue, the chance to discover what they're truly capable of. And they're about to discover capabilities that will transform them from ordinary men into living legends. Because the wilderness they're entering doesn't just test your survival skills, it tests your very definition of what's humanly possible. The mountains are about to show these men, and through their stories, show us what happens when human determination meets challenges that seem designed to prove that determination isn't enough. But here's the thing about legends. They're not born in comfort. They're forged in circumstances where ordinary people discover they're capable of extraordinary things. And what these men are about to face will test every assumption about human endurance, courage, and the will to survive. The wilderness is calling. And some of these men are about to answer that call in ways that will echo through American history for centuries. What happens when a grizzly, bear the size of a small car, decides your dinner? What do you do when your companions abandon you for dead in territory where the nearest help is 200 miles away? How do you survive when everything you thought you knew about staying alive proves worthless? We're about to find out. Because the mountains are done testing these men gently, the real trials are about to begin. August 18th, 23. Remember that date. Because what happens on this day near the Grand River in what's now South Dakota will become the most legendary survival story in American history. Hugh Glass is scouting ahead of his trapping party when he stumbles into a thicket where a massive grizzly bear is nursing her cubs. Now, let me paint you a picture of what we're dealing with here. We're not talking about some zoo bear that's been fed fish by tourists. This is a wild Rocky Mountain grizzly, 800 pounds of muscle, claws as long as your fingers, and a bite force that can crush a bowling ball, and she's protecting her cubs. Which means she's not just dangerous, She's absolutely murderous. Glass doesn't have time to run, doesn't have time to think. The bear charges, and in seconds, Hugh Glass's world becomes a nightmare of teeth and claws and unbearable pain. She tears into him with the kind of savagery that's designed by nature to kill large prey quickly. His scalp is ripped open, his throat is torn, his back is shredded down to the ribs. But here's the thing that separates Hugh Glass from the rest of us. He fights back. While this 800-pound killing machine is literally tearing him apart, Glass manages to pull his knife and stab the bear repeatedly until she finally collapses on top of him, dead. Both of them covered in blood, a canine, most of it his. Now think about this moment. Glass is lying under a dead grizzly bear, his body destroyed, barely conscious. His companions hear the commotion and come running. When they find him, they're looking at a man who should already be dead. His breathing is so shallow they have to put their ears to his mouth to detect it. Blood is pooling everywhere. What would you do? His companions make a decision that will haunt the rest of this story. They take his rifle, his most valuable possession. They take his personal belongings, and then they leave him there to die. Now, I'm not going to judge these men too harshly. They're in hostile territory, hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement. Staying with a dying man could get them all killed. In their minds, they're not abandoning Hugh Glass. They're accepting the inevitable. But here's what they don't understand about Hugh Glass. He doesn't accept inevitability. Glass regains consciousness to discover something that would make most people lose their minds. Maggots are crawling through his wounds. But Glass recognizes what's happening. The maggots are eating the infected flesh, cleaning his wounds in a way that might actually save his life. So, he lets them do their work. Think about that level of mental toughness. You wake up with maggots literally eating parts of your body, and instead of panic, you think, this might help me survive. Glass realizes his leg is broken. So he sets it himself. No anesthesia, no medical training, just pure determination and an understanding that if he doesn't fix it, he'll never walk again. And then Hugh Glass begins the most impossible journey in American frontier history. He starts crawling 200 miles across the Dakota Territory with a broken leg, infected wounds, and no supplies except what he can scavenge from the wilderness. For 6 weeks, Glass drags himself across endless prairie grass. He floats down rivers on makeshift rafts when he finds them. He eats berries when he's lucky, carrion when he's desperate. He hides from hostile war parties that would torture him to death if they found him. But here's what gets me about this story. Glass doesn't just survive. He navigates. Without a compass, without maps, with his body failing him every day, he somehow maintains his direction toward Fort Kiowa. How do you explain that? How does a man whose body is literally falling apart maintain the mental clarity to travel 200 miles through unmarked wilderness? When Hugh Glass finally crawls into Fort Kiowa, the men there describe seeing something that doesn't look quite human anymore. A walking skeleton covered in scars, filthy beyond description, but with eyes that still burn with the kind of determination that refuses to die. And the first thing Glass asks about? His rifle. He wants to find the men who took his rifle. But Glass isn't the only mountain man about to discover what human beings are truly capable of when survival becomes the only option. Jedediah Smith faces his own trial by grizzly in the Black Hills, and his story shows us a different kind of courage. When the bear attacks Smith, it doesn't just maul him, it scalps him. We're talking about claws that tear away most of his scalp and left ear, exposing the bone of his skull. Now here's what separates Smith from ordinary mortals. He doesn't panic. He doesn't scream. He calmly instructs his companions to sew his scalp back together with needle and thread, like he's asking them to mend a torn shirt. Picture this scene. You're in the wilderness, your friend's skull is exposed, blood is everywhere, and he's giving you step-by-step instructions on how to perform surgery with a sewing kit. Take the needle, Smith tells them, pull the skin tight, make sure you get it aligned properly. And then, after they've finished their wilderness surgery, Smith continues leading expeditions across uncharted territories. His journal records encounters with hostile tribes, desert crossings where men die of thirst, and Sierra Nevada passages that claim lives with every storm. But Smith keeps going, keeps exploring, keeps mapping territory that won't appear on government surveys for decades. Why? What drives a man to continue seeking danger after surviving something that should have convinced him to find a nice, safe job somewhere civilized? The answer tells us something fundamental about these mountain men. They're not seeking danger for its own sake. They're seeking something beyond the edge of what's known, what's mapped, what's safe. They're driven by a need to discover not just new territories, but new definitions of what's humanly possible. And then there's Jim Bridger, who's developing a different kind of legend altogether. Bridger becomes the greatest storyteller in the mountains, spinning tales so elaborate that listeners dismiss them as outrageous lies. He describes glass mountains where you can see for miles but can't reach what you're seeing because of optical illusions. He talks about petrified forests where everything is turned to stone, trees, leaves, even the birds singing petrified songs. He claims there are geysers that erupt on schedule, more reliable than any man-made clock. Now here's what makes Bridger's story fascinating. Every single lie he tells proves absolutely true when scientists finally explore Yellowstone decades later. Every detail he describes, the glass cliffs of obsidian, the petrified trees, the predictable geysers, it's all there, exactly as he said it would be. But people don't believe him. How could they? Bridger's descriptions sound like fairy tales. Water shooting 300 feet into the air, hot springs that could cook your dinner, cliffs made of natural glass. It's too fantastic, too impossible. Except it's not impossible. It's just beyond anything people have experienced before. And that's what these mountain men are doing. They're expanding the boundaries of what Americans believe is possible in their own continent. Think about what this means. These men are discovering wonders that seem mythical to people back east, but they're doing it through the most practical, dangerous work imaginable. They're not explorers in the comfortable sense. They're survivors testing themselves against a landscape that kills people who make mistakes. And the mountains are testing them constantly. Every day brings new challenges that could end their lives. River crossings where the current could sweep you away. Weather changes that could freeze you to death in hours. Animal encounters where one wrong move means becoming something else's dinner. But here's what separates these men from everyone else. They're learning to thrive in conditions that would destroy most people. They're not just surviving, they're mastering skills that transform them from ordinary humans into something approaching superhuman. They learn to read tracks like a language that tells complete stories about what happened hours or days earlier. They develop weather sense that lets them predict storms while the sky still looks clear. They understand animal behavior so completely that they can predict where game will be before the animals know it themselves. But most importantly, they're developing mental toughness that goes beyond anything most of us can imagine. When your daily life includes the possibility of grizzly bear attacks, Blackfoot war parties, mountain blizzards, and equipment failures that could kill you, you either develop unshakable confidence in your abilities, or you don't survive. And the ones who are surviving? They're becoming legends, not just because of what they're enduring, but because of how they're enduring it. With humor, with storytelling, with a kind of casual competence that makes the impossible look routine. Hugh Glass crawls 200 miles and then wants to get his rifle back. Jedediah Smith gets scalped and asks for needle and thread. Jim Bridger describes natural wonders that sound like lies, but turn out to be perfectly accurate observations. These aren't normal reactions to extreme circumstances. These are the reactions of men who are discovering that the human capacity for survival, adaptation, and achievement goes far beyond anything they previously imagined. And the wilderness isn't done testing them yet, not even close, because what they've survived so far, that's just the beginning. The mountains are about to show them challenges that will make grizzly bear attacks look like minor inconveniences. They're about to face tests that will separate the truly legendary from the merely tough. And when those tests come, we'll discover which of these men possess the kind of greatness that transforms ordinary mortals into permanent fixtures of American mythology. The legends are being forged, and the fire is just getting started. 1825, Henry's Fork in what's now Wyoming. If you want to understand what made America unique in human history, you need to picture what happens here this summer. Imagine a temporary city appearing like magic in a remote mountain valley. Hundreds of men converging from across the Rocky Mountains. Mountain men, native warriors, Mexican traders, company agents, even a few adventurous souls from back east who've heard the stories and come to see for themselves. This is the first rendezvous gathering, and it's creating something that's never existed before in human civilization. America's most unique cultural festival, where multiple worlds collide and somehow create something entirely new. Now, here's what gets me about these rendezvous gatherings. They're not just trade fairs. They're not just social events. They're temporary cities that spring up in places where no permanent settlement could survive, bringing together people who've spent the last year in almost complete isolation, creating a cultural explosion that shapes American identity in ways we're still discovering today. Picture the scene. Mountain men who haven't seen another white face in months are suddenly surrounded by hundreds of people. Crow warriors are racing horses against Shoshone riders. Mexican traders are offering silver and manufactured goods for beaver pelts and buffalo robes. Company agents are keeping careful accounts of who owes what to whom. And in the middle of it all, the storytelling begins. This is where legends are born, tested, and refined. Because when you put dozens of men together who've spent the year surviving impossible challenges, the stories that emerge don't just entertain, they educate. They teach survival techniques. They warn about dangers. They preserve knowledge that could save lives. And emerging from this cultural chaos is a man who's becoming the undisputed king of the mountains, Jim Bridger. Now, Bridger is special, and here's why. He speaks fluent Crow, Shoshone, and Blackfoot. Think about what that means. These aren't related languages we're talking about. Learning to speak fluent Crow and Blackfoot is like learning to speak fluent English and Mandarin Chinese. It requires not just linguistic ability, but cultural understanding so deep that you can think like people from completely different civilizations. But Bridger doesn't just speak these languages. He maintains trading relationships across tribal boundaries that are often at war with each other. He's creating a network of alliances and partnerships that spans thousands of square miles of Rocky Mountain territory. And his knowledge? His knowledge of Rocky Mountain geography surpasses government surveyors by decades. When military expeditions need guides, they come to Bridger. When scientific surveys need direction, they consult Bridger. When commercial ventures need routes through impossible terrain, they hire Bridger. But here's what makes Bridger legendary. He maintains his reputation for tall tales that invariably prove accurate. Remember those lies about glass mountains and petrified forests? Bridger keeps telling these stories, and people keep dismissing them, and decades later, every single detail proves absolutely true. What kind of mind works like that? What kind of person can observe natural phenomena so carefully that their descriptions remain accurate for 60 years, while making those observations sound so fantastic that educated people dismiss them as impossible fantasies? Meanwhile, in the Southwest, Kit Carson is building a different kind of legend. Carson becomes the most famous scout in American history, but not because he's the biggest or strongest or toughest mountain man. Carson is maybe 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighs about 140 pounds. In today's world, he'd be considered small for a high school athlete. But Carson possesses something more valuable than size. He has absolutely perfect judgment under pressure. His knowledge of desert survival makes him invaluable to military commanders who are trying to move troops through territory that kills people who don't understand its rules. His knowledge of native languages allows him to negotiate in situations where miscommunication could start wars. But most importantly, Carson earns a reputation for fair dealing that extends across cultural boundaries. Both mountain men and tribal leaders respect Carson, not because they fear him, but because they trust him. In a world where trust can mean the difference between life and death, that reputation makes Carson more valuable than gold. And then there's Tom Fitzpatrick, known as Broken Hand after a rifle explosion nearly destroys his left hand. Fitzpatrick becomes the most trusted guide for wagon trains crossing the Oregon Trail, and his success rate tells us something important about what separates good mountain men from great ones. Fitzpatrick's diplomatic skills prevent countless conflicts between settlers and native tribes. Think about what this means. You've got families from Missouri and Ohio moving through territory that's been native hunting grounds for centuries. You've got cultural misunderstandings that could explode into violence at any moment. You've got people who are scared, tired, and carrying everything they own through country they don't understand. And Fitzpatrick manages to guide thousands of families safely across this potential minefield while maintaining peaceful relationships with tribal leaders. That's not just survival skill, that's diplomatic genius. But here's what I find most fascinating about this era. These mountain men are creating innovations that will influence American culture for generations. They develop their own sign language, combining native gestures with original innovations to communicate across linguistic barriers. This isn't primitive pointing and grunting we're talking about. This is a sophisticated communication system that allows complex negotiations between people who speak completely different languages. They create winter survival techniques that blend European technology with native wisdom, building shelters that withstand mountain storms that would kill people using either European or native techniques alone. They're not just adopting existing knowledge, they're creating new knowledge by combining different approaches to the same problems, and they're mapping territory in ways that go beyond simple geography. They're creating mental maps that include seasonal variations, weather patterns, animal migration routes, water sources, and danger zones. When a mountain man describes a route, he's not just telling you how to get from point A to point B, he's giving you a complete survival manual for that territory. Now here's what you have to understand about what's happening during this golden age. These men aren't just surviving in the wilderness, they're thriving. They're creating wealth, building relationships, exploring territory, and living lives of adventure that most people can only dream about. But they're also creating something more important than personal success. They're creating American archetypes that will influence our national character for centuries. The self-reliant individual who can survive anywhere. The cultural bridge builder who can communicate across different worlds. The storyteller who preserves important knowledge through entertainment. The diplomat who prevents conflicts through understanding and respect. These aren't just frontier survival skills, these are leadership qualities that will define American success in every field from business to politics to exploration. And the rendezvous gatherings are where all of this comes together. Every summer, the mountains host what amounts to graduate school for American adventure. Men share techniques, test equipment, plan expeditions, form partnerships, and create the cultural foundations for everything that will follow. Think about what's being preserved at these gatherings. Maps that won't appear in government surveys for decades. Survival techniques that could save lives in situations most people will never face. Cultural knowledge that bridges different civilizations. Stories that preserve historical truth through seemingly mythical narratives. But most importantly, these gatherings are preserving something that's uniquely American. The idea that ordinary people can become extraordinary through courage, skill, and determination. Because that's what these mountain men represent. They're not aristocrats or military officers or government officials. They're farmers' sons and sailors and clerks who've discovered that the American wilderness offers something unavailable anywhere else in the world. The chance to test yourself against challenges that reveal capabilities you never knew you possessed. And they're proving, year after year, that Americans can not just survive in impossible conditions, end quote, they can master those conditions and create something new and valuable in the process. But here's the thing about golden ages. They never last forever. Even as these men are reaching the peak of their powers, forces are already gathering that will challenge everything they've built. The beaver market that supports their entire economy, it's more fragile than they realize. The wilderness that seems endless, it's smaller than they think. The cultural balance they've created between different civilizations, it's more delicate than it appears. Change is coming to the mountains, and when it arrives, it will test whether these legends can adapt as successfully as they've survived. Because survival skills are one thing, but adapting to change while preserving what matters most, that's the ultimate test of greatness. And these mountain men are about to face the greatest test of their lives, the Blackfoot Confederacy. If you want to understand the Mountain Man era, you need to understand these people, because they represent everything that's about to go wrong in the Rocky Mountains. The Blackfoot aren't just another native tribe. They're a military alliance of 3 nations, the Blackfoot proper, the Blood, and the Pagan, controlling territory that stretches from the Missouri River to the Canadian Rockies. And they've reached a conclusion about white trappers that's going to turn the mountains into a battlefield. The beaver belong to them, the mountains belong to them, and these white men with their steel traps are invaders who are depleting resources that the Blackfoot consider sacred. Now here's what makes the Blackfoot so dangerous. They're not just defending their territory, they're waging a systematic campaign to eliminate the mountain man presence completely. They develop tactics specifically designed to hunt small trapping parties, using their knowledge of the terrain to set ambushes that are almost impossible to escape. Think about the tactical situation. Mountain men typically work in groups of 3 to 5 people, scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness. The Blackfoot can field war parties of 50 to 100 warriors who know every canyon, every ridge, every water source in their territory. It's not a fair fight. It's not meant to be. The result is a decade-long conflict that claims hundreds of lives on both sides and transforms the mountains from a place of adventure into a place of constant danger. But the mountain men don't back down. They adapt. They start working in larger groups. They develop early warning systems using smoke signals and arranged meeting points. They form alliances with tribes that are traditional enemies of the Blackfoot, particularly the Crow, who become their most reliable allies in this mountain war. And then, in 1832, everything explodes at Pierre's Hole. Picture this. It's the annual rendezvous gathering. Hundreds of people have converged in this remote valley for weeks of trading and celebration. Families are there, native women married to mountain men, children playing between the lodges, elderly tribal members sharing stories around campfires. It's supposed to be neutral ground, a place where even enemies respect the peace of commerce and cultural exchange. But a war party of Gros Ventre warriors, allies of the Blackfoot, decides to attack. What follows becomes the largest single engagement between mountain men and native forces in the history of the fur trade, and it shows us something crucial about what these mountain men have become. When the attack begins, there's no panic, no chaos. These men who've spent years surviving impossible situations simply transition from traders to warriors in a matter of minutes. William Sublette takes a musket ball through the shoulder while leading counterattacks that save the gathering from complete destruction. Mountain men, friendly Nez Perce, and Flathead allies coordinate their defense like a professional military unit, protecting the women and children while maintaining offensive pressure against superior numbers. The battle lasts for hours, And when it's over, the message is clear. Attacking mountain men and their allies is no longer a low-risk strategy for anyone. But the Blackfoot conflict isn't the only war these mountain men are fighting. Corporate warfare erupts between the American Fur Company and Rocky Mountain Fur Company. And this conflict shows us a different side of mountain man character. Because when John Jacob Astor's wealth challenges their independence, these men who've mastered survival in the wilderness have to learn economic survival in a business war. Company agents engage in economic sabotage that would make modern corporate raiders nervous. They steal trapped furs, bribe native allies to switch sides, undercut prices to drive competitors into bankruptcy, and spread false information about trap locations and trading opportunities. The competition grows so fierce that armed confrontations occur at trading posts throughout the Rockies. We're talking about shootouts between business rivals that look more like military engagements than commercial disputes. And the mountain men discover something important. Survival skills translate perfectly to business warfare. Men who can track enemies across granite slopes can certainly track corporate conspiracies through trading networks. Men who can read people well enough to negotiate with hostile tribes can definitely read people well enough to outmaneuver business rivals. Meanwhile, Jedediah Smith's California expeditions bring him into conflict with Mexican authorities who view American trappers as potential invaders, and they're not wrong to be suspicious. Smith's party faces arrest, imprisonment, and forced deportation while gathering intelligence about Mexican military weakness and California's economic potential. His detailed reports reach Washington politicians who use the information to plan future territorial acquisitions. Now think about what this means. Smith isn't just exploring for beaver. He's conducting reconnaissance for American expansion. His maps, his observations about military installations, his assessments of Mexican control over California territory, e.t. All of this information feeds into political calculations that will shape American policy for decades. The mountain men are becoming more than trappers. They're becoming intelligence assets. But the most important alliance they form is with the Crow tribe, and this relationship shows us something essential about mountain man character. The Crow become the mountain men's most reliable allies, providing military support against Blackfoot raids while maintaining extensive trading relationships. But this isn't just a marriage of convenience. It's a genuine cultural partnership based on mutual respect and shared interests. Crow warriors fight alongside mountain men in numerous battles, sharing intelligence about enemy movements and offering sanctuary during dangerous winters. Mountain men learn Crow language, adopt Crow customs, and often marry into Crow families. What emerges is something unique in American frontier history, a genuinely integrated community where cultural differences enhance rather than threaten cooperation. But here's what makes these conflicts so significant for American history. They're teaching the mountain men lessons they'll use when the United States starts expanding westward in earnest. They're learning how to fight unconventional wars against opponents who know the terrain better than they do. They're learning how to gather intelligence in hostile territory. They're learning how to form alliances with local populations. They're learning how to adapt quickly to changing tactical situations. In short, they're developing exactly the skills the United States will need when it starts fighting wars of expansion across the American West. But they're also learning something darker. That conflict in the wilderness isn't just about individual survival anymore. It's about competing visions of what the American West should become. The Blackfoot vision. Traditional hunting grounds preserved for traditional peoples using traditional methods. The Mountain Man vision. Integration of different cultures, creating new opportunities for everyone willing to adapt. The corporate vision. Systematic resource extraction, designed to maximize profits for distant investors. These aren't just different approaches to making a living, they're fundamentally different ideas about what America should be. And as the 1830s progress, it becomes clear that these visions can't coexist peacefully. One of them is going to win, and the others are going to disappear. The question isn't whether conflict will come. The question is, which vision will survive when the fighting is over? And the mountain men, who've spent years learning to survive anything the wilderness can throw at them, are about to discover that surviving social and economic change is harder than surviving grizzly bears. Because the wars they've been fighting in the mountains, those are just preparation for the war that's coming for their entire way of life, the 1830s. If you want to understand how quickly the world can change, you need to understand what happens to the mountain men during this decade. Because in less than 10 years, everything that made their way of life possible simply disappears. It starts with fashion. Fashion. Think about that for a moment. European gentlemen decide they prefer silk hats to beaver felt hats, and suddenly an entire American industry collapses. Beaver pelt prices don't just decline, they crash. We're talking about a fall from $6 per pound to $1 per pound. That's like waking up one morning to discover your salary has been cut by 83%. Except worse, because there aren't any other jobs in the Rocky Mountains. Now here's what gets me about this collapse. The mountain men have spent years mastering the most difficult skills imaginable. They can survive blizzards that would kill Arctic explorers. They can track game across terrain that looks identical to the untrained eye. They can negotiate with hostile tribes, fight off grizzly bears, and navigate thousands of miles of wilderness using only natural landmarks. But none of those incredible skills matter when the market for beaver pelts disappears. Company executives who've been making fortunes from mountain man expertise suddenly abandon their investments. Supply chains that took decades to establish are dismantled in months. Trading posts that served as lifelines for isolated trappers are simply closed. The men who've risked everything to build this industry find themselves stranded without markets for their goods, without supply sources for their equipment, and without the economic foundation that made their lifestyle possible. And then comes 1840, Horse Creek, Wyoming, the last great rendezvous. Picture this scene, because it's one of the most poignant moments in American frontier history. A handful of aging mountain men converge on a valley that once hosted thousands of people for the greatest cultural festival in the American West. The celebration feels more like a funeral. Veteran trappers who once competed to tell the most outrageous stories now share quiet conversations about departed friends and vanished opportunities. Jim Bridger and Kit Carson discuss their uncertain futures while watching younger men abandon the mountains for California goldfields. The rendezvous system that created a unique American culture is dying, and everyone knows it. But the economic collapse isn't the only catastrophe striking the mountain men's world. Smallpox epidemics devastate native tribes throughout the Rocky Mountains, killing thousands of potential allies and trading partners, while destabilizing political relationships that took decades to establish. Now, smallpox isn't just another disease, it's a civilization killer. When smallpox hits populations that have no immunity, mortality rates can reach 90%. Entire communities disappear. Cultural knowledge accumulated over centuries vanishes with the people who carried it. The Mandan tribe virtually disappears. The sophisticated agricultural people who provided crucial support for early fur trading operations are reduced from thousands of individuals to dozens of survivors. Blackfoot and Crow populations suffer massive casualties that end their roles as major military powers. The complex tribal politics that mountain men learn to navigate simply cease to exist when the tribes themselves are devastated by disease. Think about what this means for the mountain men. Their survival has depended on understanding and working within native political systems. They've learned languages, married into families, formed alliances that provided protection and trading opportunities. When disease destroys those systems, the mountain men lose more than trading partners. They lose the cultural foundation that made their way of life possible. And meanwhile, wagon trains begin appearing on mountain trails with increasing frequency. The Oregon Trail becomes a highway of emigration that transforms pristine wilderness into a commercial transportation corridor. Families from Missouri and Ohio start crossing territory that belonged to a handful of mountain men and their tribal allies. At first, this seems like an opportunity. Mountain men can serve as guides, making good money from their geographical knowledge, but they quickly realize that these wagon trains represent something more dangerous than economic competition. They represent permanent change. These families aren't coming to the mountains to trap beaver or trade with native tribes. They're coming to farm, to build towns, to establish the kind of settled civilization that mountain men have spent years escaping. Mountain men witness their private kingdom becoming a public thoroughfare. The isolation that made their culture possible is ending, replaced by a steady stream of people who see the wilderness as something to be conquered rather than something to be understood. And then Mexican-American tensions escalate toward inevitable war. American settlers flood into Texas and California territories, creating political crises that will reshape the entire continent. Mountain men find themselves caught between loyalty to their adopted homeland and recognition that American expansion will destroy their way of life. Some join military expeditions as scouts, using their skills to serve American territorial ambitions. Others retreat deeper into unexplored territories, hoping to find places where the old ways can survive. But here's what's really tragic about this period. The mountain men can see what's coming, but they can't stop it. They've survived grizzly bears, hostile war parties, corporate sabotage, and economic warfare. But they can't survive progress. They can't fight demographic change. They can't compete with agricultural settlement and industrial development. The forces destroying their world aren't malicious. They're inevitable. American population growth, technological advancement, and economic development create pressures that no individual, no matter how skilled or determined, can resist. And the mountain men discover something that survival training doesn't prepare you for: watching your entire way of life become obsolete. Think about what they're experiencing. Men who've defined themselves through mastery of the most challenging environment in North America suddenly find that their expertise isn't needed anymore. Skills that took years to develop and perfect become curiosities rather than necessities. Worse, the values that made them successful — independence, self-reliance, adaptation to natural environments — become obstacles in a world that rewards cooperation with institutions, submission to legal authority, and exploitation of natural resources. They're not just losing their jobs, they're becoming anachronisms. But here's what separates the truly great mountain men from the merely skilled ones: the ability to adapt even when adaptation means abandoning everything that once defined you. Jim Bridger recognizes that the future belongs to people who can serve the wagon trains rather than compete with them. Kit Carson understands that his scouting skills will be more valuable to the military than to fur companies. Tom Fitzpatrick sees that his diplomatic abilities can help prevent conflicts between settlers and tribal populations. They're learning to reinvent themselves without losing their essential character. But not all mountain men can make this transition. Some retreat deeper into the wilderness, hoping to preserve the old ways in places that haven't been touched by change. Others simply fade away, unable to find new purposes for skills that no longer matter. The 1830s and early 1840s represent more than the end of the fur trade. They represent the end of a uniquely American experiment in cultural integration and individual freedom. For a brief moment in history, the American West offered something unavailable anywhere else in the world: the chance for people from different backgrounds to create new ways of living based on mutual respect, environmental adaptation, and personal excellence. That moment is ending, and the men who created it are about to face the ultimate test of their character. Can they preserve what matters most about their culture while adapting to a world that no longer needs what they do best? The storm clouds aren't just gathering anymore. The storm is here. 1846. The Mexican-American War begins, and suddenly the United States government discovers that those useless mountain men possess exactly the skills needed to win a continental war. Kit Carson guides General Stephen Kearny's Army of the West across the Southwest, using knowledge that no military academy could teach. His understanding of desert survival, water, sources, and local politics proves more valuable than artillery when it comes to moving troops across hostile territory. Think about the irony here. Just a few years earlier, Carson was considered an anachronism, a relic of a vanishing frontier. Now he's essential to American military success. Tom Fitzpatrick negotiates treaties with Plains tribes to prevent interference with military operations, using diplomatic skills developed through years of managing conflicts between mountain men and native populations. His ability to communicate across cultural barriers becomes crucial to American strategy. But here's what's fascinating about this transformation. The mountain men aren't just serving American expansion, they're shaping it. Their knowledge of Western geography, their relationships with native tribes, their understanding of desert and mountain environments, all of this influences how American conquest unfolds. Without mountain man expertise, the Mexican-American War would have been longer, bloodier, and possibly unsuccessful. The United States conquers the Southwest not just through military superiority, but through geographical knowledge accumulated by men who spent decades learning the land's secrets. Meanwhile, Jim Bridger is making a different kind of adaptation. Bridger establishes Fort Bridger in 1843 as both a trading post and way station for California-bound emigrants. His strategic location on the Oregon Trail generates steady income from wagon train supplies while maintaining connections to his mountain past. Now, here's what makes Bridger's story so compelling. He's not just adapting to change, he's positioning himself to profit from it. Bridger recognizes that the future belongs to people who can serve the emigrant trade rather than compete with it. So, he becomes the most successful businessman in Wyoming Territory, using mountain man skills to create modern commercial success. His trading post provides essential services to travelers, equipment repair, fresh supplies, geographical information, and most importantly, psychological comfort in the middle of a terrifying journey. But Bridger doesn't abandon his mountain man identity. He maintains his reputation for storytelling, his relationships with native tribes, and his encyclopedic knowledge of Rocky Mountain geography. He adapts without losing his essential character. Joe Meek represents yet another kind of transformation. Meek emerges as a political force in Oregon Territory, helping establish territorial government and serving as territorial marshal. His transition from mountain man to politician demonstrates how survival skills translate into leadership abilities. Think about what Meek brings to politics. The ability to make quick decisions under pressure, the skill to negotiate with people from different backgrounds, the experience of managing conflicts before they become violent. These aren't just frontier survival skills. They're exactly the qualities needed to establish stable government in territories where legal authority doesn't yet exist. Meek's influence helps shape Oregon's early statehood movement, while maintaining respect among both settlers and tribal leaders. He becomes a bridge between the Old West and the New West, preserving valuable aspects of mountain man culture while embracing political progress. But the most dramatic change comes in 1848 with the California Gold Rush. Suddenly, thousands of fortune seekers are crossing mountain passes that only a few dozen mountain men previously knew. The wilderness highways become crowded thoroughfares, destroying the isolation that made mountain man culture possible. Former trappers become wealthy guides, charging enormous fees for knowledge that once belonged to a select brotherhood. A mountain man who might have struggled to sell beaver pelts for enough money to buy supplies can now earn a year's income, guiding a single wagon train across prairies. Familiar territory. But this success comes at a cost. The exclusive knowledge that made mountain men special becomes common information. The secret routes they discovered become public highways, The cultural isolation that created their unique lifestyle disappears under waves of emigration. Railroad surveys begin mapping transcontinental routes across mountain passes that trappers discovered decades earlier. Government engineers consult aging mountain men for geographic knowledge, while planning infrastructure that will eliminate the need for individual trail expertise. The Iron Horse prepares to replace the Mountain Horse in America's westward expansion. Now here's what you have to understand about what's happening during this period. The mountain men aren't just losing their profession, they're losing their relevance. For 40 years, they've been the only people who could safely cross the American West. Their knowledge has been exclusive, essential, and irreplaceable. Now that knowledge is being systematized, mapped, and made accessible to anyone with the price of a railroad ticket, the skills that made them legends, survival in isolation, adaptation to unknown environments, mastery of tribal politics, become less valuable in a world where isolation disappears, environments become mapped and settled, and tribal politics become irrelevant to American expansion. But the truly great mountain men find ways to remain relevant by transforming their skills rather than abandoning them. Bridger becomes a guide for scientific expeditions, military surveys, and commercial ventures, proving that his geographical knowledge remains valuable even in a changing world. Carson joins the military as a scout and Indian agent, using his cultural understanding to prevent conflicts during a period of rapid change. Fitzpatrick serves as Indian agent for the Central Plains, helping negotiate treaties that establish frameworks for peaceful coexistence between native tribes and D5 American settlers. They're adapting their mountain man skills to serve new purposes in a new world. But not all mountain men can make this transition. Some retreat deeper into unexplored territories, hoping to preserve the old ways in places that haven't been touched by change. Others simply fade into obscurity, unable to find new applications for skills that no longer matter. The most tragic cases are the men who define themselves so completely through mountain man identity that they can't imagine being anything else. They become living relics, performing their old roles in a world that no longer needs what they do best. Think about what this means for American character. The mountain men represented something essential about American values, the idea that individuals could create their own destinies through courage, skill, and determination. As their era ends, that ideal doesn't disappear, it transforms. The frontier spirit becomes entrepreneurial spirit. The survival skills become business skills. The cultural adaptability becomes political flexibility. But something is lost in the transformation. The mountain men proved that Americans could thrive in environments that seemed impossible to master. They demonstrated that cultural integration could create opportunities for everyone involved. They showed that individual excellence could coexist with community cooperation. The New West offers different opportunities, but it also imposes different constraints. Success increasingly depends on cooperation with institutions, rather than mastery of natural environments. Progress requires submission to legal authority rather than adaptation to local conditions. The mountain man era is ending not because these men failed, but because they succeeded too well. They opened the West so effectively that their own lifestyle became impossible to maintain. They conquered the wilderness so completely that there's no wilderness left to conquer. And as the 1840s draw to a close, the last mountain men face a choice that defines the rest of their lives. Embrace the new world they helped create, or spend their remaining years mourning the old world they can never restore. Most choose to embrace change, but they never stop missing what they've lost. Yellowstone National Park, 1972. A team of archaeologists working near Old Faithful makes a discovery that vindication takes more than a century to arrive. They uncover a cache of beaver traps, camp remains, and personal artifacts that prove mountain men lived and worked exactly where their stories claimed they did. Every impossible tale about geysers erupting on schedule, about glass mountains and petrified forests, about natural wonders too fantastic to believe, all of it confirmed by physical evidence. Jim Bridger's lies proved to be precise geographical descriptions that surpass government surveys for accuracy. Modern archaeological excavations throughout the American West continue this pattern of vindication. In the Grand Tetons, Colorado Rockies, and Sierra Nevada, researchers discover artifacts that transform folklore into documented history. Arrowheads marked with mountain man tool marks, cabin sites in locations that match exactly with diary descriptions from the 1830s, trade goods that confirm the extensive commercial networks these men established across thousands of miles of wilderness. But here's what gets me about these discoveries. They're not just confirming that mountain man stories were true, they're revealing that the mountain men were better observers and record keepers than the trained scientists who dismissed their accounts. When John Coulter described the thermal features of what became Yellowstone, his observations were so accurate that modern geologists use his descriptions to understand how these natural phenomena worked 200 years ago. When Jedediah Smith mapped river systems and mountain passes, his cartography was so precise that his routes remained the standard for decades after government surveyors finally reached the territories he explored. When Hugh Glass described the wildlife populations and seasonal patterns of the northern plains, his observations preserved ecological information that helps contemporary researchers understand environmental changes over time. These men weren't just surviving in the wilderness, they were conducting scientific research without realizing it. Their survival depended on understanding their environment so completely that they became, in effect, natural scientists of the highest caliber. Geographic features throughout the American West bear mountain man names that preserve their discoveries for future generations. Bridger Pass, Smith River, Carson City, Jackson Hole, Sublette County, Dye S. Hundreds of landmarks create a living map of mountain man exploration. Their names mark every major route across the Continental Divide, ensuring permanent recognition of their contributions to American expansion. Modern interstate highways follow paths first walked by mountain men. Railroad routes trace corridors discovered by fur trappers. River crossings still use fords identified by men who had no bridges except their own ingenuity. But the mountain man legacy goes deeper than geography. The mountain man spirit lives on in American cultural values that trace directly to their wilderness experiences. Self-reliance, environmental awareness, cultural tolerance, individual freedom, IF. These concepts become central to American identity, partly because mountain men proved they could work in practice. Their integration of multiple cultural traditions creates lasting American archetypes that influence literature, cinema, and national mythology. The cowboy, the frontier hero, the rugged individualist, AG. All of these figures draw from mountain man examples. Modern outdoor recreation movements, wildlife conservation efforts, and wilderness preservation campaigns draw inspiration from mountain man relationships with the natural world. The idea that wild places have value beyond resource extraction comes partly from men who learn to see wilderness as home rather than obstacle. But here's what I find most remarkable about their scientific legacy. Mountain man geographical descriptions continue to guide contemporary research. Scientists studying climate change use mountain man observations about historical weather patterns, animal migration routes, and seasonal variations. Their oral traditions preserved environmental information with accuracy that surpasses written records from the same period. Geologists exploring natural phenomena follow routes mapped by mountain men decades before official expeditions reached the same areas. Botanists studying plant distributions find that mountain man descriptions of vegetation patterns remain accurate guides to understanding ecological relationships. The lies of Jim Bridger guide contemporary scientists to natural phenomena that official expeditions missed entirely. His descriptions of geological formations, hydrological systems, and biological communities provide baselines for understanding how Western environments have changed over time. Contemporary DNA analysis reveals extensive mountain man ancestry among Western American families, proving that their cultural influence extended far beyond their historical period. Their descendants carry genetic markers from multiple ethnic groups, reflecting the multicultural marriages and partnerships that characterize frontier society. Mountain men didn't just explore the West, they helped populate it with people whose heritage spans continents. But perhaps the most important part of their legacy is what they proved about human adaptability. Mountain men demonstrated that people from completely different backgrounds could learn to work together when survival depended on cooperation. They showed that cultural integration could create opportunities rather than conflicts. They proved that individuals could master environments that seemed designed to kill them. These lessons matter now more than ever. In a world facing climate change, resource depletion, and cultural conflicts, the mountain man example offers hope that humans can adapt to challenging circumstances without losing their essential humanity. They faced changes that seemed impossible to survive, the collapse of their entire economic system, the transformation of their physical environment, the obsolescence of skills they'd spent decades perfecting. And the best of them found ways to adapt while preserving what mattered most about their character. Think about what this means for us. We face changes that seem impossible to manage: technological disruption, environmental degradation, social fragmentation. The mountain man example suggests that adaptation is possible even when the changes seem overwhelming. But their legacy also includes a warning. Excellence alone isn't enough to guarantee survival. The mountain men were supremely skilled at what they did, but their skills became irrelevant when the world changed around them. The ones who survived and thrived were the ones who could reinvent themselves without losing their essential character. They learned new skills while preserving core values. They adapted to new circumstances while maintaining personal integrity. That's the real mountain man legacy. Not just the ability to survive in difficult circumstances, but the wisdom to recognize when circumstances require fundamental change. Their stories echo through American culture because they represent something essential about human potential. They prove that ordinary people can become extraordinary when they're willing to test themselves against challenges that reveal capabilities they never knew they possessed. The mountains that tested them still stand. The passes they discovered still cross the continental divide. The natural wonders they describe still inspire visitors from around the world. But most importantly, the spirit they embodied, the willingness to venture into unknown territory and discover what you're truly capable of. That spirit remains available to anyone brave enough to answer the call of their own personal wilderness. The mountain men are gone, but their echo in granite reminds us that greatness isn't about the circumstances you face. It's about how you choose to face them. And somewhere in the American character, that echo continues to reverberate, calling each generation to discover what lies beyond the edge of the known world. The wilderness is still calling. The question is, who will answer